This video, we will talk about the idea of production costs and productivity. Now, within a firm and really broader society, productivity is simply a measure of how much output is generated by a unit of input. So if we think about labor productivity, we generally think about it in terms of an hour of labor. And of course, we have a concept called the production function, which simply shows how production occurs, more or less. So if we think about a shaken ice espresso, the production function here would include labor, the espresso maker, espresso, water, ice maker, milk, so on and so forth. Now, we can see that over time, productivity in the United States has grown pretty substantially, although it's starting to level off. And a big reason for this is, of course, technology, computers and automation and all of that. Now, when we think about production costs of the firm, I always like to use Starbucks as an example here because it's something that a lot of people are at least familiar with, even if they're not a big fan. And so the first thing we need to do is to distinguish between the short and the long run. In the short run, at least one of your many production variables are fixed, but in the long run, they are all variable. So if we think about, for example, a Starbucks in the short run, they're going to be limited by a few things. They're going to be limited by their counter space. They're going to be limited by the number of registers that they have. They're going to be limited by the amount of raw materials that they have to make product. They're going to be limited by the capital, which is, of course, like the espresso makers. Because they have these constraints in the short run, they run into a problem called diminishing marginal productivity. Now, you may recall from earlier in the semester a concept called diminishing marginal utility, where as you consume more of something, you value each additional unit less. Diminishing marginal productivity kind of is similar. And what it says is that as we add more units of an input, we are going to get subsequently less output if nothing else changes except that one variable. Okay, so for example, in the Starbucks scenario, if we add more and more labor, each additional worker is going to produce less than the previous one. And this would look like this top chart would show that. So your marginal product will initially increase, meaning as you add in additional workers, you get some marginal gains. So if we think about Starbucks, you've got one person working by themselves. They have to do everything from start to finish. Take the order, ring up the customer, make the drink, hand them the drink, wipe down the counter, all of that. If you have a second worker come in, well, they can divide those tasks up based off of each person's own comparative advantage, meaning what they have the lower opportunity cost in. So whoever's really quick at making drinks will make the drinks, and the other person will ring people up. Maybe you add a third worker in. Now you got two people making drinks, one ringing up. But as you keep adding workers in, they have less capital and equipment to work with. As I said, there's only so many espresso makers and blenders, and so they're not as productive as their counterparts, and so the marginal productivity will start to decline. Now, it can, if you add too much labor into the mix, actually go backwards, where adding another worker means total output falls. And that could simply be because people are running into each other, or what I've also seen happen in my work experience is you get a lot of people in a space and they each expect the other person to do the work. Okay. And because of this phenomenon, of marginal productivity declining, your marginal costs will eventually start to rise because you're getting less output for the same amount of input cost. And so your costs increase. Now, when we think about the costs incurred by a particular firm, there are a few broad categories, okay? Marginal cost is the cost to produce one additional unit, okay? And this is extremely important in microeconomic theory because you will continue to make product as long as the marginal revenue, how much money you get from selling that one unit, is higher than the marginal cost, how much it costs to produce that one more unit. When that flips, you have made too many units. And so kind of the golden rule in microeconomics is to always produce as close to MR equals MC as you can without going over where your marginal cost is greater than your marginal revenue. Okay. Now, within a business, we have things that are called fixed costs. Fixed costs do not change as the level of output increases. So an example of this might be the rent on a particular property or the salary that you pay to employees. Wages, hourly wages would be considered a variable cost because they will change with the level of output. So for example, if it's a slow day at Starbucks, they may send workers home early, cut down on some of that labor costs, okay? Other things that fall into that variable category would include raw materials. So if we're thinking about Starbucks, we would be looking at coffee beans, creamer, coffee cups, lids, stir sticks, stoppers, etc. A very important one that you really want to keep in mind are what's called sunk costs. Sunk costs are unrecoverable, and you cannot really consider them in future economic analysis because they're gone. They are never coming back. You have to keep looking forward. And in some instances, your fixed costs can become sunk costs. And this is exactly what I'm referring to here. Let's say that you have rent and you have decided, I'm going to try to open a business and I am going to sign a lease where I'm going to pay $1,000 a month rent for the next 24 months. And so whether you unlock the door and have 1 million customers come in to buy your product, or you keep it locked and no one comes in, you're on the hook for that rent. So that is a sunk cost, okay? You should not consider that going forward. When should you consider that rent cost again? When does it become unsunk? Well, the next time you come up for contract negotiations on your rent, and we'll talk more about that here in a second when we get into shutdown decision making, okay? And so you have this, and then of course we can categorize the different costs. Of course, coffee beans are going to be a variable cost. Creamer would be variable. Labor, if it's hourly, is variable. If it's salaried, it would be fixed. Cleaning supplies generally would be variable because you would directly correlate cleaning supplies to the amount of volume. Utility bills also going to be part fixed, part variable. And the espresso maker is probably going to be a fixed cost because it's the price of it's not going to change depending on how many units you sell. Now, one thing I do want to point out is some of these, as I kind of stumbled through them, they do not fit neatly into one category or another because you're going to have, for example, some labor costs just to keep the lights on. But for the most part, your hourly labor would tend to be more variable, okay? Now, one thing that I did kind of want to skip forward to, or at least like skip in terms of the course here, is the idea of the shutdown. Now, when we think about shutting down, let's think about, let's do some quick math here, actually, because I can throw this on here. So let me, all right, so let me do a very simple example here. So let's say that each month we pay rent of $2,000 regardless of whether the doors are open or not. We collect revenues each month of, let's say, $10,000. And then we have monthly variable expenses and fixed expenses, I suppose. Just non-rent expenses, what I'm driving at, are $9,000. All right, so if we look at this from a purely accounting perspective, what would we find? Well, we would find that we are collecting $10,000 in revenues, and we are generating $11,000 in expenses because we've got the $9,000 here plus the rent. And so we are actually losing, our accounting loss, if we stay open, is $1,000 per month. Okay, does that make, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, now you may decide, or you may think to yourself, well, if I'm losing $1,000 a month, I'm going to go ahead and shut the doors. Okay, well, that would not be a good idea in this case, because you still are going to be on the hook for this rent of $2,000. So are you better off paying the $1,000 a month in loss or two? And of course, it's better to only lose $1,000 versus $2,000. And the idea here, of course, and something that you kind of need to keep in mind going forward, is that as long as you're able to cover your variable costs in the short run, you are going to remain open. And then in the long run, you will make a decision about whether you should stay open past that time. It could be that at the end of your lease, you go to the landlord and say, hey, I can't afford $2,000 a month rent. I'm losing $1,000 a month here with that. You can negotiate and say, hey, I can give you $500 a month. I got to turn a profit here. Now, what's the landlord going to say? This is where we go back to a very fundamental concept, and I keep bringing it up because it's just so important, is opportunity costs. If the landlord has a lot of other potential tenants that would like to rent that space, they are probably going to tell you to go fly a kite. That, nope, I'm not doing 500, 2,000's my firm offer, and that's generous. However, if that spot is not in demand and other rental properties in the area are lying vacant, they may very well accept $500 a month, because $500 a month and some revenue is better than it sitting idle with zero. And so the important thing that really I want to keep emphasizing here is a lot of these market decisions that are made come down to opportunity cost and what other options are available.